Welcome to the pocket. My name is Scooter, here to present to you my week 11 power rankings. This is going to be my first actual YouTube video giving you guys my power rankings. I've done them here and there so far this season, and I've struggled to keep up with them. I've done my best, but this week the Giants have a bye, which means I got an extra one or two videos that I can make. And I thought maybe I should do a draft video breaking down the quarterbacks that the Giants could take, but I figured there's going to be plenty of time in the off season for that. And this time would be best used to give you guys a fresh idea of how I view each team in the NFL. So, as you can see, in my tier list, I have the tiers as hopeless, scrappy, competitive, playoff contenders, and Super Bowl contenders. Just to add some context, the hopeless teams doesn't mean they have no hope for next year or anything. It just means that they are essentially mathematically eliminated from the playoffs and they aren't really a scrappy team. They're a bad team. The scrappy teams are some combination of not being mathematically eliminated or being quite close, but they're better than the hopeless teams that are beneath them. They have either a higher ceiling or a higher floor. Now, the competitive teams tier is one of the most interesting ones. As you can see, there are only 12 teams above the competitive teams tier, which means that two of these teams will make the playoffs. And I expect all of the teams in this tier to be pushing until essentially the very end, trying to make the playoffs. And then, of course, the tier above that, you got your playoff contenders. These are teams that are clearly more established and you have more confidence are going to make the playoffs and maybe can make some noise too, win a game or two, potentially get to like a conference championship. But then above that, we got the Super Bowl contenders. These are the teams that are obviously the cream of the crop. They either have a really high ceiling, a high floor, and they're not really missing much when it comes to say quarterback, offense, defense, coaching, and culture, and things like that. So now that we've gotten that out of the way, let's get into the list. And we're going to start at the bottom, kicking it off with the Las Vegas Raiders. I'm going to give you their points scored, points allowed, point differential, and turnover differential, as I feel like those four stats best summarize what the team is capable of, what their ceiling and floor is, and, whether or not they're beating teams by a lot or if they're getting turnovers. I think those two stats add context to the wins. So the Raiders are 25th in points scored at 18.7. Points allowed, they're 30th. Very bad at 27.9 points per game. Their point differential, they're 29th in the NFL at minus 9.2 per game. And turnover differential, they are 20th. That is last because lots of teams are tied in turnover differential. And the scale for that is first to 20th. So minus 14 for the turnover differential. I think that really is the biggest reason I have them down here. Their point differential is by two possessions over 9 points. And when your turnover differential is the worst in the NFL, that means on offense, you can't play a clean game to save your life. And then on defense, you can't make up for it. You can't force turnovers. If you lose the turnover battle essentially every game, then you're going to lose pretty much all those games. I don't know off the top of my head what their turnovers were when they beat the Browns and beat the Ravens, but I would assume those are two of the cleanest games that they played all year. So it seems to me them winning those games, it was mostly just luck or circumstantial for them, having a good game, not turning the ball over. No upside really with this team. They don't really have a quarterback. Gardner Minshew's not the answer for them. Aiden O'Connell hasn't developed at all. So the Raiders are 32. Second to last, 31st overall, we have the New York Giants with a 2-8 record. So actually technically worse than the Raiders. You could argue that they're the worst team in the NFL. And why? Because their points scored is last in the NFL, 32nd with 15.6 points per game. Dreadful. Absolutely awful. Points allowed, a lot better at 15th, only allowing 22.2 points per game. That gives you a point differential of minus 6.6, so about a touchdown. Obviously that's not good. That's 23rd in the NFL. And then their turnover differential, they're tied for 16th, so the bottom quarter of the league at -6. So what this all means to me is that if this team, this Giants team, is going to win more games for the rest of the year, they have to basically play a perfect game, especially offensively. You have the worst offense in the league when it comes to scoring points. So what does that mean? When you get your red zone opportunities, you can't mess up a single one of them because you might not get back to the red zone. You might not get into field goal range. We haven't had good field goal kicking all year or special teams. It's been really, really bad. Now the defense might be 15th in points allowed. However, when it comes to yards allowed or run defense, the Giants have allowed the most yards per carry in the NFL so far this year. So that defense is really just hanging their hat on leading the NFL in sacks, and that's all there is to it. But not much else to say about the Giants. I spent a little more time on them, obviously, being a Giants fan. I'm going to give you a little bit more of my take about them. But yeah, second worst team in the NFL. Now, 30th, we got the Cowboys at 3-6. Now, their stats are going to be a little bit better than this ranking. 23rd in points scored, almost 20 points per game, 19.7. That's what that is. They do have the second worst defense in the league, allowing 28.8 points per game. They got a -9 point differential and -10 for turnover differential. That ranks 18th, so almost the worst in the league. And now Dak is shut down. I mean, there's a real chance that this team is the actual worst team in the NFL. But I do feel like Cooper Rush, this team has played with him before. But I heard CeeDee Lamb is questionable with a back injury. So if he doesn't play, then they certainly are the worst team in the NFL. I think they're just tanking at this point. Moving on to number 29, we have the New Orleans Saints at 3-7. They pulled off a win against the Falcons. And now that Derek Carr's back and they're recovering from some of the injuries, I'll give you the last 3 weeks for some of their stats. But as of their whole season, they're 16th in points scored at 22.7. They're 24th in points allowed at 24.6. That puts them 20th for point differential at -2, essentially. And they're actually tied for 7th in turnover differential at +4. Now, this team did trade Marshawn Lattimore. And although Derek Carr is back, they're down to Marquez Valdes-Scantling as their number one wide receiver. Olave is injured. He's on the IR with all these concussions. But their offense has been 28th the past 3 weeks, averaging 16.7 points per game. Why do I bring this up? Well, in the beginning of the season, this team looked like a for sure playoff contender. They were averaging like 40 points per game. They played the Cowboys and the Panthers, and what do you know? They have the two worst defenses in the league. So giving they caught them off guard. They exposed them. As the season went along, this offense really turned out to not be nearly as good as we thought they were. And I think this team is in a desperate need of a new quarterback and a hard reset. Up next, at number 28, we have the Browns at 2-7. They're 29th in points scored at 16.4 points. And points allowed, they're 21st at 23.7. That puts them at 26th for point differential at -7 and 7.3 points per game. Turnover differential tied for 17th at -7th. So that's very not good. Winston provides a better ceiling, but the floor is still really bad. When he's throwing like 4 interceptions, you're just not going to win games. This defense, I think they're unmotivated. They're not trying anymore. They know this offense is letting them down. This team is just in dire need of a new quarterback and a future at the moment. And I think like the Giants, like the Saints, they're just ready for this season to be over. Moving on to number 27, we have the Carolina Panthers, who just came off a win in overtime against the Giants, a game where both teams were essentially trying to lose, fumbling the ball away in the fourth quarter, and then the Giants get the kickoff, and they fumble on the first play of their possession and just lose the game just like that. But, I mean, when you look at the hard stats, this looks like the worst team in the NFL. Points scored, they're 28th, 16.7 points per game. Points allowed, 32nd, 31 points per game allowed. Point differential is the worst in the league, -14.3 points. And turnover differential, they rank 15th, so bottom quarter at -5. Now, I guess it is getting better. They just pulled off, I believe it's 2 wins in a row, one against the Saints and one against the Giants. But I don't really think it really says that much about them, just based off the fact that Bryce Young could continue to play better. I think that's why I put them ahead of the Browns. They beat the Saints, so that's why they're ahead of them. And the rest of the teams are pretty much just collapsing. So that's how they got here, and they're the top of the hopeless tier. So moving on to our scrappy teams. At the bottom of this list at number 26, we have the New England Patriots at 3-7. Now they are 31st in points scored at 16 points per game, but in points allowed, they rank 12th. So actually the first like top, 15, top 12 stat we've seen of a team when it comes to points scored or points allowed. So even though they still have a -8 point differential, which puts them around the bottom like eighth of the league, like, somewhere around that 28 range. Their turnover differential is tied for 14th, so that's not good either at -4. I like where this team is going. Their defense seems to keep them in every game, um, or at least keep the over low, kind of hold the team uh, lower to what the expected point total is that the other team will score. And like I said, I like where Drake May is. I think he looks good considering how bad of an offensive situation is. They got some young wide receivers, Douglas, Polk, and Baker. Some guys are all competing in there, and some of them will rise, and they got more draft capital and free agency to spend on that moving forward into next year. But since this is a list about this year, I only put them here because of their defense and their ability to consistently sort of stay in games and slow down the opposing team. So I would say they're scrappy, and they do have 3 wins. They can catch you off guard, but I think they have a pretty low ceiling overall. Now the Titans, I have them at 2-7. This is mostly just because they beat the Patriots. I don't think they're really that much better or anything. And in fact, their stats almost look even worse. They're 27th in total offensive points, 17.4. I mean, that's not quite as bad as the Patriots, but then points allowed, 29th. That's pretty bad. 26.7 points per game. So their point differential's 30th at -9.3, and their turnover differential is second worst in the NFL at 19th. They are -11. A lot of that was Will Levis. A lot of their defensive points allowed is being inflated by that game versus the Lions, where they got absolutely destroyed. But I just don't see a great ceiling for this team. Obviously, when you're rolling out a guy like Mason Rudolph and his number one wide receiver is Calvin Ridley, who was very disgruntled early this year. It's just I don't see the path to success with this team, but I think they've got a little bit more talent than the teams below them. And like I said, they beat the Patriots. Moving on to number 24, the Jacksonville Jaguars. This might be a little controversial. They are 2-8, uh, but I feel like this team they've got more upside than all the teams below them. Right? Points scored, they're 21st at 20.2 points per game. Points allowed, they're 27th at 26.4. So their point differential is 24th, which is actually exactly where they land on this list at -6.2 points per game. Their turnover differential is bad. They're tied for 17th at -7. So I feel, like I said, that they're much better than their record would indicate. If they end up shutting down T-Law, because I believe he's dealing with a shoulder injury or something, then they're definitely going to be one of those hopeless teams. But I think when T-Law has played, every few games he'll have a really nice day, and they'll put up like 28 points or something like that, but their defense just completely folds in those situations, and that's not his fault. But where I'm going with this is I feel like their offense does have the potential to win them a couple games moving forward for the rest of the year, and I don't think they're going to finish with 2 wins. Moving on to number 23, we have the Indianapolis Colts at 4-6. Looks like they're gonna move off of Joe Flacco and bring AR back into the starting lineup. And this team is honestly kind of surprising. I have them at 23, but their points scored is 18th at 20.8 points per game. Their points allowed is 16th. So this defense is a little better than I thought it was. 22.3 points per game. That gives them a 19th ranked point differential at -1.5 points per game. And for turnover differential, they're tied for 10th, right down the middle. They have 0. So that means they have turned the ball over just as much as they have received turnovers from opposing teams. I don't really know what the deal is with this team. I mean, Anthony Richardson, I get he's young and I get he was pretty raw coming out, but I feel like he should be a lot further along than this. And he should just stop screwing around trying to put Joe Flacco in there and win games, because he's not your future, right? I think if you keep AR in there for this entire season, he's not just going to be bad the whole year. He's going to develop, and worst case scenario, he's going to be more prepared for next year, right? So I don't know what the issue is. Seems like they got a pretty average offense and defense with Joe Flacco and the combination of him and Anthony Richardson. But I don't know. Maybe he doesn't develop this year and they could finish even lower than this. But as of now, they have 4 wins, which is better than any other team we've listed so far. So I guess what that means is I think they are the worst 4-win team in the NFL. But you could argue that is the next team, number 22, the Chicago Bears at 4-5. They are 24th in points scored at 19.4. And for points allowed, they're seventh. So good defense, 18.6 points per game allowed. Point differential is actually above, it's positive, 0.8. That puts them at 15th. And their turnover differential is great. They're tied for third at +8. So it's pretty clear and obvious that this defense is keeping them in games. And you would have thought with Caleb Williams and Romo Dunze, Keenan Allen all being added on top of DJ Moore. You also added DeAndre Swift, who I don't think is like phenomenal, right? But he was better than, just rolling out Roshan and Khalil Herbert. Now you got a more experienced receiving back. Their offense is still wildly inconsistent. A lot of people are blaming the coordinator, and he definitely had his issues in Seattle. But I think in the end of the day, a guy as hyped up as Caleb Williams should start figuring it out by this point in the season. I mean, Stroud, he definitely had Bobby Slowick, but it's not like he was dealing with a great offensive line or anything or a spectacular run game. They were rolling out Devin Singletary, so Bears got to figure it out on offense, and they can definitely redeem themselves. But right now, they really look like they're falling apart a little bit. Now, at number 21, the New York Jets, 3-7. I don't know how this is possible. I mean, I really thought their floor was like 9 wins. It just looks like a complete disaster, and that the talent on their roster is their only hope. I don't know what is wrong with the coaching. You could blame Aaron Rodgers for all of this. Maybe it is his fault for being too much of a control freak, but the reality is they're 3-7, and they got to figure out how to make changes to this team and this culture if they're going to turn this season around and basically win out. Um, Points scored, they're 26th in the NFL, scoring 17.7 points per game. Points allowed, they're 10th, averaging 21.4 points per game allowed. Point differential is 22nd in the NFL, minus 3.7. Then their turnover differential, they're tied for 14th. That's not good at -4. So, like I said, I think we all know the deal with the Jets. They're a talented team on offense and defense, but if they can't all get on the same page, then they're going to stay in the scrappy tier and they're not going to make the playoffs. I think most people expect that. This season is already over for them. Moving on into the competitive teams tier, a team that beat the New York Jets earlier in the year in a very bad weather game at MetLife is the Denver Broncos, who are 500. They're 22nd in points scored, 19.7, and points allowed. They're fourth. A top 5 defense so far in points per game allowed, 17.7 points. Now for their point differential, they're +2, so they're above average in the league. And turnover differential, they are 11th, so not great at -1, but you can kind of offset that and say early on in the year, Bo Nix was throwing a lot more picks, so I'd say in the past few weeks they're actually positive on turnover differential. So I think we all admit that Bo Nix and Sean Payton has worked so far. For a rookie quarterback, this you can't ask for much more than being 500 10 weeks into the season. So if he can continue to develop, then this team will climb up, right? And I'll be more confident that they can make the playoffs and make some noise because the defense is so great. But until I see some more upside, some more consistent playmakers out of this offense, then I'm not going to push them up much further than this. I think they've got a high floor because of their defense, but their ceiling is just capped. And I don't see them being better than the teams above them. So moving on to number 19, we have the Miami Dolphins, who are 3-6, but we know that's because Tua was injured. Their points per game is 30th at 16.3, but in the past 3 weeks, they're 9th, scoring 25.7 points per game. So I would look at that moving forward as what their actual offense is it's top 10. Now, points allowed, they're 17th. I thought it was worse than this, 22.4 points per game. Point differential, like I said, it's skewed. And their turnover differential, once again, it's skewed, but they're 13th at -3. So the difference with Tua being back is crazy to me. I wouldn't classify myself as a Tua hater in years past, but I definitely did not give him enough credit for what he was able to do in executing this offensive scheme, because without him, I mean, the Dolphins just couldn't get anyone to do it. So I think moving forward, even though they only have 3 wins, they're 3-6. I think they could pull off some wins and potentially sneak into a playoff spot. So that's why they're in this tier and above the Broncos, because I think they have higher upside than the Broncos. Up next, another team with 6 losses is the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, ranking number 18. Their offense is top 5, fifth offense with 27.9 points per game. Points allowed, 28th though, at 26.6 points per game. So they still have a positive point differential of 1.3. That's still above average. And their turnover differential, they're tied for 10th. So they, cancel out their turnovers with other teams. It's just a bad year for them with the injuries. Evans and Godwin being injured at the same time, Godwin being out for the whole year. Such a huge part of this team. Like you see, they got the 5th ranked offense. And some of that they've even continued to do without Godwin and Evans. So very impressive what Baker Mayfield's been able to do for this Bucs team and prove that it wasn't a fluke last year. They can make some noise, I believe, when Evans comes back, but I gotta see it. They're already at 6 losses, so hopefully Evans can come back and make things good for the Bucs again. Moving on to the next team, ranked number 17 is the Atlanta Falcons at 6-5. So I have a team with a above 500 record, ranked below the average of the NFL. They're 13th in points scored, 23.8 points per game, and points allowed, they're 20th at 23.6 points per game allowed. So they barely have a plus 0.2 point differential. That puts them right down the middle in the NFL. And their turnover differential is a little worse than average. They rank 12th out of 20th at -2. I'm just not convinced that this offense is as good as 13th. Both times that they played the Buccaneers, who have the 28th most points allowed, that's when they've really gone off. So I think they're really skewed. Their offensive success stats are skewed based off of those 2 games. Kirk, yeah, he's been pretty decent, but I don't really see him going toe-to-toe with some of the guys in the playoff contenders tier. This team is worst in the NFL in sacks. It's just not a combination that I'm convinced is going to win them playoff games or decisively get them there. And the team above them beat them, even though they're below 500. That's why they're there. Number 16, the Seattle Seahawks at 4-5. Points scored, they're 15th at 23.3, and points allowed, the 23rd with 24.6 points per game allowed. So that gives them a negative point differential of 1.3. That puts them at 18th in the NFL. And turnover differential is bad, tied for 16th, -6. So the deal with the Seahawks is pretty much when they're healthy, they're a much better team than this. They're more like 12, but they've suffered injuries to the defensive line in the trenches early on in this year, and they've struggled to overcome those. And then DK Metcalf also got injured. So JSN did step up. So this team does have hope to still make the playoffs and, get back above 500 just for now. But it just seems to me like it's not their year. They're kind of inconsistent. Mike McDonald, the new head coach, is doing his best with the defense, but when they're not healthy, they can't get it done. So just kind of the exact epitome of an average NFL team, the Seattle Seahawks. Up next is the LA Chargers, 6-3. Great record, but they've probably played the softest schedule of anyone in the league so far. But look at their team stats. Points scored, 19th at 20.7. Okay, could definitely be better. But points allowed, they're first in the NFL, averaging 13.1 points per game allowed. That gives them the 5th point differential at plus 7.6 points per game. And their turnover differential also tied for second at plus 9. I just got to see more, right? They've done what they should do. If you're an above average NFL team and you play the easiest schedule in the league, I would expect you to be 6-3 or 7-3. So I need to keep seeing more success from them against tough opponents. I believe they play the Bengals this week. So until I see those games happen, I'm not going to push them any further than this unless if they disappoint. Moving on to the number 14 team. We have the Rams, who are 4-5. Points scored, they're 20th at 20.6, but in the past 3 weeks, they ranked 15th with 23.7 points per game. That's with Cup and Puka starting to come back. Their defense is 21st in points allowed at 24.1. So their point differential is negative. But like I said, that's skewed a little bit due to the injuries they had earlier in the season to their receiving core. And their turnover differential, they are tied for ninth at +2. So they're a little bit better at getting the turnovers than their opposing teams are. I just believe in the Sean McVay, Matthew Stafford, Cooper Cup, Puka Nacua combination, right? The defense has exceeded expectations with all the youth and turnover. So as long as the defense can continue to be, you know, between average and 21st, then they're going to be all right on that side of the ball. And then you just trust Stafford, McVay, and his receivers to win games in the fourth quarter. So I definitely think they've got potential to still make the playoffs. Moving on to number 13, we have the Cincinnati Bengals, who are 4-6, but I think they're the best sub 500 team in the NFL, and that's indicated here. I have the Rams and the Bengals representing that category. In points scored, they're sixth in the NFL at 27 points per game, but their points allowed, they're 25th at 26.2. So their point differential is positive. Their turnover differential, they're right down the middle. They have 0, so they're tied for 10th. When I think they're on, right, when their offense is on, I really do think they're the best offense in football. You know, Lamar is crazy. He's doing a wonderful job with the, Zay Flowers, Derrick Henry. It didn't look great early on in the year with some of the new offensive linemen, but they've obviously figured it out. You could probably argue the Ravens are a more explosive offense, but I just think consistently, drive to drive, I think the Bengals would score more often, right? The Ravens have a lot more explosive plays. But I just trust Joe Burrow in the 2-minute drill, just a teensy bit more. We've seen him do it in the playoffs. Still something we got to see from Lamar. So even though he's having the best season of any player this year, that's where I'm coming from when I say I think they have the best offense in football. Is I think they're very reliable. They're not very matchup dependent. Moving on to oh yeah, actually I have a little bit more to say about the Bengals. I know they're below 500 right now, but I strongly believe that they're going to make it into the playoffs. They're going to go on a little bit of a run, and when they do make the playoffs, right, assuming that does happen, they will be hot, right? Because they would have had to have won at least 6 of their last 7 games or something like that, right? To at least to get 10 wins, whether it's 10 wins or 9 wins that gets them in. So they're going to be hot, right? So if that does happen, then this is going to be a very dangerous team. I just wanted to leave that in there. Moving on to number 12, we have the Arizona Cardinals. At 6-4, this team is coming on. They have one of the least talented, right, least expectation driven defenses in the league. A lot of people looked at them and said they had the worst defensive roster. Well, they're 12th in points allowed at 22 points per game. Their points scored, they're 13th at 23.8. So they have almost a 2-point differential. They're 12th in the NFL. Pretty good. And their turnover differential tied for 10th at 0. They're just a well-rounded team. And Kyler Murray has returned. A lot of people have hated on Kyler over the years, saying he's he's Call of Duty merchant, double XP, all this stuff. But if you ask me, Kyler Murray's a top 10 quarterback. And if you just give him an average defense like this, he's going to pull off some upsets. And that's what he's done this year. Moving on to the number 11 team, a very similar team that did beat the Cardinals earlier on this year. The Commanders at 7-3. Points scored, they're 4th in the NFL at 28 points per game. Points allowed, they're 14th with 22 points per game allowed. So their point differential is pretty good. They're 10th at 5.9, so that's landing them pretty close to where they rank on this list. And their turnover differential is 6th at +5. You could say that they're potential frauds. They haven't beaten a winning team yet. The Giants were able to hang with them in both, at least the first game. Second game wasn't as close. But I think they've still got a lot to prove. But just based off of their record, right, it's a lot different than being like the Chargers where you're 6-3. I think they've played a little bit of a tougher schedule. They've blown bad teams out a little bit more than the Chargers have. And in the games that they did lose against better teams, I think they were just a little bit more competitive. Moving into the top 10, at number 10, we have the Minnesota Vikings at 7-2. They're 10th in points scored at 24.6 points per game, and they're third in defense at 17.4 points per game allowed. That gives them the sixth best point differential at 7.2. And their turnover differential is also above average, tied for seventh at +4. But I think they're falling off a little bit. I don't trust Sam Darnold. I think teams are starting to figure out this offense a little bit. He's throwing a lot of interceptions, turning the ball over a lot. And if this team is going to stay as consistent as they have been with this point differential and how good their defense has been, they can't afford to turn the ball over and give the other team points. But in the end of the day, they still do have a great defense, and the offense is still effective despite Sam Darnold because of the run game, because of Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison, and TJ Hawkinson are back in the lineup. So this team is dangerous. I just don't see it when it comes to them going on some deep playoff run because I think eventually Darnold's going to run into an elite defense and he's going to get exposed. So moving on to number 9, we have the Houston Texans at 6-4. In points scored, they're 17th at 22.4. In points allowed, they're 19th at 22.6. So they have a negative point differential barely at minus 0.2. And that puts them at 17th in the NFL. But their turnover differential is great. They're 4th at +7. But I would say this team has been a little bit strange to evaluate this year. They lost Nico Collins for 5 weeks, and he was elite for them. So having him come back is going to definitely propel them and give them an opportunity to climb on this list. But I would also like to mention that the drop off from 17th points scored per game, the 17th rank, to 18th is basically a 2-point jump. So they are in a better tier, right? 22 points per game is, it's not above average, but it's much better than everyone else who is below average. But as I said, they're getting Nico Collins back. And even though their defense hasn't played amazingly, they rank 19th in points allowed. I think they have the right structure to beat anyone. If you're really good at forcing turnovers and the offense is effective again with Nico Collins, then that's enough to catch any team off of their feet. I just think we need to see it. We need to see the team start to gel again with Nico Collins back in the lineup. They don't have Diggs anymore. So it's back to having just Nico, Tank, and I believe John Mechie or Bobby Trees is their wide receiver 3. So that's a pretty good wide receiver trio right there. But I think their upside was definitely hurt when Diggs got injured permanently for the whole year. Moving on to number 8, we have the Green Bay Packers at 6-3. Now, the Packers are 9th in points scored at 25.6. Points allowed, they're 11th. Pretty good at 21.6. Point differential is 11th at +4. And their turnover differential, they rank 5th in the NFL at +6. Jordan Love just needs to stay healthy. They're coming off the bye. I think it's going to help them. I think they're going to look like a different team. Like I said, you get the team healthy and practicing together again. And that's all this team really needs to do. I think this team just needs to show up and get to the playoffs because it seems like they're one of those teams, kind of like the 49ers, that the further into the season they get, they improve more than other teams, right? And we saw that last year, how well Jordan Love played in the game against the Cowboys, in the game against the 49ers, and the second half of the season as a whole. I think that's what we are going to see. So keep an eye out for the Packers to surpass some of the teams ahead of them. And now the last team in our playoff contenders, I have the Pittsburgh Steelers, who are 7-2, and they have turned to Russell Wilson as the starter, and boy, has that helped a lot. They're now 12th in average points per game at 24.3. That's really good. A lot better than any of the Steelers teams I can remember in the past years. And on defense, they are second in points allowed at 16.2. Point differential, they're 4th in the NFL at 8.1. And turnover differential, they're tied for second at +9. Russell Wilson is the perfect fit for this like Arthur Smith offense where you're running the ball, you're using a lot of play action, taking advantage of the quarterback's mobility, right? He doesn't have to be Lamar. He just has to be able to roll out and things like that. And I just can't stop thinking about Russell Wilson and his days in Seattle running a very similar scheme, leaning on a strong elite defense, and that being a combination for championship football. If they can continue to not allow that many points per game and force a ton of turnovers. The way Russ has looked so far this year, I trust him to win close games against very great teams. Now, the toughest part of their schedule is definitely coming up, so we'll get a great read on them for the rest of the season. They play the Ravens this week. It's going to be huge. I believe it's at Pittsburgh, and if it is, then they might even need to be favored to win because generally they beat the Ravens when they play them at home. But yeah, keep an eye out for the Steelers. I think they're a sleeper team. I think teams are doubting them, and I don't think they should be taken lightly. Now moving on to our Super Bowl contenders, and I am a Giants fan, but I must give credit where credit is due. The Philadelphia Eagles are 8-2, and they rank sixth for me as the last ranked Super Bowl contender on my tier list. Points scored, they're eighth in the NFL at 29.5. That's a great offense. Points allowed on defense, 17.9. That's fifth. Now, I will say they have not played the toughest part of their schedule. A lot of their wins have come against teams like the Browns, the Giants, so it's inflating some of these stats. But either way, what do you expect? What are you asking from a good team other than to blow out bad teams? I mean, it's a sign that they're a different class, right? They're not just squeaking out a win against a bad team. They're dominating them. I'd like to see them be a little more competent against the better teams that they've played. Like, I mean, the Commanders, yes, they destroyed them in the fourth quarter, but until that point, it was not looking too good. But yeah, as I mentioned, their point differential is very good. Second in the NFL, plus 11.6. And their turnover differential, it could be better. They're tied for ninth, so they're slightly above average at plus 2. Saquon, I think, in the end of the day, is like their Christian McCaffrey. Don't look at it, please. I don't want to talk about it. But like I said, he's like their Christian McCaffrey. It reminds me of when the 49ers added him. And when your quarterback is struggling to make plays in the passing game and kind of improvise, going to your running back is a great way to make sure your offense always has a chance to get yards. And I think that might just be the little piece of consistency that this offense has been missing when teams are able to either double A.J. Brown or contain A.J. Brown and Smitty. Jalen Hurts doesn't really make a lot of use out of guys like Goddard and, whether it's Johnny Wilson, whoever their wide receiver 3 ends up being. I think Saquon is sort of a remedy for that. So when they need their offense to make a play and their passing game is bottled up, Saquon makes the most out of this top 5 offensive line that the Eagles have given to him. Moving on to my 5th ranked team, the 49ers, who are not 8-2. No, they're 5-4, and I have them ranked above the Eagles. In points scored, they're 8th, 29.5 points per game. Their points allowed on defense is 18th in the NFL at 22.4. Their point differential is 7th at plus 7.1. And their turnover differential is tied for 8th at plus 3. So why do I have them ranked above the Eagles? Well, I didn't really have a lot of confidence that CMC would be back and 100%, but he's back, right? And they're coming off a bye. This team has suffered a lot of injuries in games or last second before games, and I think it's really thrown them off early in the year. And like I said about the Packers, this team just after bye weeks is just different, right? When it comes time for the playoffs and time for them to show up, they know how to. They're a very experienced roster, and I just have a lot more faith in this coaching staff than Nick Sirianni and the Eagles coaching staff, to be honest. Now, I think if they played this year, it would definitely be closer than it was last year, but I still think the 49ers would win, hence why they're 5 and the Eagles are 6. Moving on to my number 4 ranked team, the Buffalo Bills at 8-2. I feel like we've seen this story before, right? They got the third most points scored at 29 points per game. Points allowed, they're 9th at 19.3. Point differential is 3rd because of that at plus 9.7. And their turnover differential is 1st in the NFL. That's a huge sign that this is a team primed to go on a run this year. Plus 13 in the turnover game. They lost Diggs. Who needs them, right? And their defense has turned it on, even despite all the turnover that they had this offseason. I guess Sean McDermott, a lot of people are doubting him coming into this year. Not sure that he was the guy to make the most out of Josh Allen, but he once again has this team playing at an elite level. That point differential is always a great way to tell how great a team is. Eagles fans, leave me alone. But I'm much more convinced by it when the Bills do it. They play the Chiefs this week. But this new run game of theirs, rather than leaning on the passing game and Allen's connection with Diggs, it's been very effective. Obviously, they're third in points scored. They added Amari Cooper. Shakir is their slot receiver. Kincaid's going to be out this week, but he's been a solid tight end for them. And then they got other guys like Keon Coleman, right? Their rookie, as basically their wide receiver three, depending on whether you consider the slot or the X to be the wide receiver three in this case. But I just like where this team is going. If they can get Amari Cooper going, this actually I think could be one of the best teams, and by best I mean top two, right? Going to the Super Bowl. That's going to be the X factor for them. Is can they make the most out of having Amari Cooper? Amari Cooper has not been good this year, but he's a great player, and maybe he was just in a bad situation. So I really like that move by them. But for now, they're going to stay at 4. Number 3 is the Chiefs. These two teams are going to play this week. I guess that game is going to determine where these two teams are next week. But the Chiefs are undefeated. They're 9-0. Points scored, they're 11th, actually. 24.3 points per game. Their defense, we know, is great. 5th in points allowed, 17.9. Point differential, they are 9th, plus 6.4. In turnover differential, they're 13th at -4. So that's the only team stat that they don't look good in right now. But their offense seems a lot worse than 11th, right? But I guess it's more the turnovers that's making them look bad. They're still the Chiefs. They're still undefeated. You can call their wins BS, but at the end of the day, they know how to finish games. It's kind of like the 49ers. This is an experienced team that I would trust to win pretty much any game. They beat the Ravens earlier this year. And aside from that Chiefs game and Raiders game, the Ravens have looked unstoppable since then. So uh, obviously, I think they deserve to be number 3 and here in the top 3 as Super Bowl contenders. But moving on to the Baltimore Ravens, who are number 2 at 7-3. They did lose to the Chiefs, they did lose to the Raiders, and they did lose to the Browns. But their offense is first in the NFL at 31.8 points per game. Points allowed, they're 25th at 25.3 points allowed per game. Point differential, they're 8th at 6.5. Their defense obviously has been selling, but their turnover differential is still pretty good, tied for 7th at +4. Lamar Jackson is having an insane season right now. He really is. If you're into like fantasy football, you know having Lamar Jackson on your team this year is an absolute godsend. He blows every other quarterback out of the water. He's averaging like 25 points per game. I get it's like the rushing upside, but he's really been incredible in every facet this year. I mean, the way he's been scrambling, making something out of nothing. He's easily the MVP this year. And whenever you have the MVP, you're probably a top 3 team. So, and it's not just like, oh, he's the MVP, but the team is average. No, the team is winning because of him. This team had a lot of turnover on the offensive line. Lamar could have made that worse by not working with him and adjusting to him, but obviously he's learning to play with them. And they're going to land at number 2. I'm really excited to see what the Ravens do. I always want them to beat the Chiefs in the playoffs, but you never know what's going to happen when we get to that point because records mean nothing. What you've done at that point means nothing. Just what happens in that game means something, and that's usually why the Chiefs, I think, come out on top because the Ravens have all these expectations because their ceiling is so high, but they just can't achieve that when they play the Chiefs. But as of now, they look better than the Chiefs, so I'm gonna put them above there. But doesn't mean I think they played in the playoffs right now that they would win. It's a very interesting conversation with these top 3 teams. And number 1, we have the Detroit Lions at 8-1. This team has come so far over the years. I mean, really, they're second in points scored at 31.6, just barely behind the Ravens. And points allowed, they're 8th at 19 points per game allowed. That puts them in first place in the NFL at point differential. That's a correlation as to why they're ranked number 1. But their turnover differential is also 3rd at +8. I mean, this team is just the best team in football right now. They really are. They have everything they need. And you know what? When you're the best team in football, when you have the second best offense and you have the 8th best defense when it comes to just points allowed, right? And your turnovers are 3rd, you're tied for 3rd in the league in turnover differential. That means you're protecting the ball, you're taking it away from the opponent, you're scoring when you take it away, and even when they take it away from you on the rare occasion, you're probably going to stop them from scoring, right? Now, another thing their defense does is that since their offense is so good and they're usually ahead, they tee off, right? They don't play backed off and prevent defense. No, they try to force turnovers and hence you see they're tied for third. They're at +8. Obviously, their run game is probably the best in the NFL, if not like tied for first or second. I guess you could say like the Eagles or maybe the 49ers or Ravens. Nah, I'd say the Ravens probably have the best, like most dynamic run game, but the Lions just down the down. Give me the Lions run game, right? Rotating Gibbs and Montgomery, this offensive line. And then you got the play action that comes off of that with Jared Goff and Ben Johnson. The play calling that has been coming from him last year and this year has been great. There's no fall off there. Dan Campbell, probably one of the best motivating head coaches you've ever seen. And honestly, I think it's an underrated aspect when it comes to the playoffs. I did not have any expectations for the Lions last year. I thought, oh, they're a fun story. Um, I'm rooting for them, but I don't want to see them go to the Super Bowl because I just think they're going to lose. But you know what? When they played the who was it last year? The Rams and the Buccaneers and the 49ers. I thought once they got to that 49ers game, all right, the Rams and the Bucks, whatever. But the 49ers, oh man, the 49ers are going to kill them. No, the Lions jumped out to like a three score lead against the 49ers. Now their defense did blow that lead and they did lose that game. But I honestly, at that point, it clicked for me that this team, this culture is no joke. This team is ready to win a Super Bowl. And when you get into the playoffs and you got a guy like Dan Campbell telling you that you need to do your assignment because he loves you so much and he just expects you to do it, man, honestly, I feel like it helps, right? So this to me is the Lions' year. It reminds me of when the Rams built that super team and they just had everything fall into place. They're going to play really tough against any opponent. Although the Ravens last year did play this Lions team that was also great last year, and the Ravens destroyed them. Now, I know this is a different Ravens defense, so I am putting the Lions above them, but just because I think the Lions are so great doesn't mean we're not splitting hairs between not just this tier, but every tier. I mean, NFL and football in general, there's not that many games. The margin for error is not very big. Obviously it's not like baseball where everything's about execution, right? Execution and precision. Like you can just be bigger and stronger in football, but your margin for error with the game planning is slim to none. So a lot can still change, but right now I don't think there's much of a discussion here. The Lions look like the best team in the NFL, and I'm excited to see what they can do. So I was hoping to make sort of a updated playoff predictions or Super Bowl pick for this season because looks like the one that I made before is not going to stand, at least from the Jets. But I am going to just kind of bloop one in here. I'm not saying I won't give another one when we get to the playoffs, but just right now, mid-season Super Bowl prediction, I'm going to say, based off of my power rankings right here, that we're going to have the Lions come out of the AFC. They're going to beat either the Eagles or the 49ers in the NFC Championship. And I'm going to say, obviously these top three AFC teams, any three of them could make it, but just the way it looks right now, I'm just going to say the Ravens. They get out of there and they play the Lions in the Super Bowl. And I'm going to say that, for one, that is going to be an amazing shootout of a game. It really is. I mean, the Lions defense is pretty good, but I don't think they're going to be able to contain Lamar Jackson. But this Ravens defense has been so bad, and nobody can contain the Lions. So it should be very interesting what would happen in that matchup. But I am going to take the Lions. The way they look right now, that like I said, I'm not saying they don't have like a few like holes here and there, right? They did lose Aiden Hutchinson, but at the end of the day, this team, you're not complaining about holes when you look at this team. I mean, they've got pretty much something for everything. So that's my Super Bowl prediction, midseason Super Bowl prediction, and that's my power rankings for Week 11. Did my best to try to incorporate some stats and evidence to back up what I was about to say, give you some context, but also kind of just give you my thoughts, right? Stats can be boring. So I like to give you some stats and then tell you the story behind them. So that's my power rankings. Thank you all so much for watching.